In part 1, we explored what geopolitics and especially its imperialist branches are and what terminology it deploys. In part 2, we reviewed Russia's big plan and their motivations behind it. In part 3, we examined Russia's plans for conquering West Europe. In part 4, we recapped the proposed plans for Eurasia South and Africa. And if you think that Dugin's plans so far have been bold, you need to think again. Now we'll be looking at the direction where Dugin sees Russia's most horrifying opponent, China, which he finds to be far more dangerous than thalassocratic USA. We'll also be recapping the plans Dugin lists for both USA and Russia internally before wrapping up the empire-gathering part of this book. In the East, Dugin finds the most terrifying geopolitical entity on the planet, far exceeding the horrors of thalassocratic US of A. Here, Dugin needs to come up with a roadmap for permanently ending China, which is one of the oldest great civilizations on this planet, once and for all. In a plan mirroring other directions, Dugin tries to spare Russia from spending its own resources, but wants to find temporary allies to do the dirty work for them. Russia's economy and population is strongly centered to the western parts of its landmass. To secure long-term success in the east, he proposes multiple actions to tighten the grip of these neglected territories, which include starting a high-priority invasion war, stealing others' industry, and shooting itself intentionally to the leg. Once again, Dugin is screening for one preferred ally, but making sure not to pick someone who could have the strength to oppose Russia in the long term. He argues that Japan fits this description perfectly. Proceeding from the fundamental principle of a common enemy, Russia should strive for a strategic alliance with precisely those states that are more burdened by political and economic pressure from the Atlantic superpower, have a historical tradition of geopolitical projects that are opposed to Atlanticism, and have sufficient technological and economic power to become a key geopolitical reality of the new bloc. Russia and Japan together could restructure the far eastern part of the continental Eurasia. And let us remind ourselves what the Japanese tradition of geopolitical projects and history of restructuring far eastern Eurasia actually means. Even by only shortlisting examples from living memory, one might presume countries like China and South Korea might feel unease if Japan would really start demonstrating solidarity with Russia. Here, in Western Europe, the atrocities of the Nazi regime are well known and considered as a candidate for humanity's lowest point throughout all of history. But what Japan has done, most recently during the Second World War, provides a tight race to the bottom. For the other allies Dugin is proposing in the other directions, Germany and Iran, it is easy to find evidence pointing at least to partial success since 1990, but for Japan it seems that the reception has not been as warm. Instead, Russia seems to be finding better resonance with North Korea, whose ability to contribute to Dugin's plans is much weaker than Japan's would be, especially when it comes to investments and industry. And mirroring the other geographies' so-called allies, Dugin wants to assure that Russia builds the ability to dispose of Japan when the need arises. This he wants to achieve by luring Japan into investing and building its industry to the least developed parts of Russia in Siberia. This he sees as a pathway to building larger population base to Siberia and eventually allowing Russia to steal the industry as it did to many Western companies' assets after the start of full-scale war in Ukraine. In return, Dugin does not propose that Russia would do anything it would not already do otherwise, sell energy and minerals, and arm itself with weapons. He wants to ensure that any dependencies that develop are as unilaterally on Japan's side as possible. The Japanese and Russians could as soon as possible create an unprecedentedly powerful geopolitical center covering Siberia, Mongolia, Japan itself, and, in the long term, the entire Pacific region. In exchange for strategic protection and the direct access to the Eurasian resources, Japan could quickly and effectively help the Russians in the technological development and the development of Siberia, laying the skeleton of an independent regional organism. Japanese technological and financial assistance would solve many problems in Russia. Axis Moscow-Tokyo also solves a number of critical problems in both countries. Firstly, Russia is getting into allies of the economic giant, equipped with highly developed technology and huge financial potential. However, Japan lacks political independence, a military strategic system, and direct access to resources. Everything that Japan lacks is abundant in Russia, and everything that Russians lack is in abundance among the Japanese. The resources of Siberia will eventually be connected with the high technologies of continental Europe and developed Japan, and when this can be realized, the planetary domination of thalassocracy will end. It would be interesting if there were new and updated editions being published on Dugin's book, and reading how much he is currently looking forward to incorporating their Far Eastern allies' industrial capability to solidify Russia's superiority. But in the discussion for East, Dugin spends less time elaborating allies, but instead focuses on the red elephant in the room. He speaks very dismissively of China, which only confirms the terror Dugin feels about it. He seeks to present China only as a local threat, inconveniencing only one geographical part, instead of acknowledging China for the global player it is. China is Russia's most dangerous geopolitical neighbor in the south. He further seeks to downplay China's geopolitical position as a rimland and accusing it of lacking its own agenda by being simply Atlantist's puppet. China undoubtedly belongs to the rimland category, in this which geopolitics have never had a shadow of a doubt. China is dangerous for Russia for two reasons, as the geopolitical base of Atlanticism and in itself, as a country of increased demographic density in search of no man's spaces. Even Dugin struggles to find words that would deny China's economic surge. China's economic successes are rather ambiguous reality, since they have been achieved at a cost of deep compromise with the West, and cannot be combined with any clear geopolitical concept that could serve as a guarantee of political independence. The reason Dugin is so obsessed with China is that he sees that almost all arguments he makes to bolster Russia's claim to Eurasian and world power also apply to China. And what's even worse is that China is doing it better than Russia. And keep in mind that Dugin's book was published in 1997. China's development since then has been nothing short of astonishing, whereas Russia, in the meanwhile, has continued its existence mostly as a gas station masquerading as a country. For Dugin, the worst part of China is that its global influence is based largely on its industrial strength, as this strength only grows the more experience they accumulate. Russia's claim to power, which is based on supplying liquefied dinosaurs, on the other hand, gets both depleted and at the same time becomes less and less relevant as other sources of energy become more viable alternatives. Mirroring the actions Dugin proposes also for others who commit the ultimate sin of rivaling Russia's geopolitical interests, he proposes that also China should be dealt with aggressively. China in the eastern regions of the new empire should be compared in the west not to England but to France, since in relation to its Eurasian empire will be guided by two criteria. In case of active opposition to Eurasian projects, China will have to be treated as a geopolitical adversary with all the ensuing consequences. China has every chance of becoming a geopolitical scapegoat in the implementation of the Pan-Eurasian project. Ultimate goal is to permanently disassemble China as a state entity to prevent it from ever challenging Russia again. In the case of China, we are talking about force-based positional geopolitical pressure, about provoking territorial disintegration, fragmentation, and political and administrative redistribution of the state. The same approach applies to Turkey. China and Turkey are potential geopolitical opponents. In the case of opponents, one should strive to do harm. And when someone is talking about disintegrating and redistributing the entire state, these are euphemisms for genocide and ethnic cleansing. As preparatory steps towards this ultimate goal, Dugin is proposing that the battle for Lenaland should be Russia's second highest priority, right after Ukraine, and that Russia should urgently begin preparations towards winning this war. In geopolitics, major battles are won long before they become an open form of political or international conflict. The geopolitical battle for Lenaland should begin now, although widespread attention will be drawn to this region later. We'll be coming back to assessing the Lenaland proposal in just a short moment's time. Before initiating open and armed attack against China, Dugin proposes to pave the way by various actions aiming to destabilize China. As we have already learned from other directions, Dugin is keen on exploiting any and all existing tensions within enemies' societies in an attempt to make enemies spend their energy in internal fighting. In the case of China, Dugin is looking to benefit from ethnic and geopolitical tensions in Tibet, Mongolia, and Xinjiang, political tensions against USA, and ideological tensions against the Communistic Party. This can be done by provoking internal Chinese separatism, Tibetans, Mongols, and the Muslim population of Xinjiang, playing regional contradictions, and also with the active political support of the anti-Atlantic, purely continental forces of the potential Buddhist and Taoist lobby within China itself, which in the future may lead to the establishment of such a political regime in China itself, which will be loyal to the Eurasian Empire. Tibet is a separate country with a special population, a specific region, and ancient political and ethnic traditions. Beijing's power here is also artificial and based on direct violence, as in Xinjiang. Russia is geopolitically directly interested in actively supporting separatism in these areas, and in the beginning of the anti-Chinese national liberation struggle in this area. The irony here is delicious, as Dugin acknowledges that others' claim to power may be artificial if it is only based on direct violence. Ultimately, shaking things up is not enough for Dugin. He wants Russia to annex the parts that China cannot hold firmly and leverage them as barriers for further damaging China. Xinjiang and Tibet must enter the belt of tellurocracy. Without Xinjiang and Tibet, China's potential geopolitical breakthrough into Kazakhstan and Western Siberia becomes impossible. If Russia would in reality be acting upon these kinds of plans in China, China's security services would be aware of them. And if these security services would learn of such plans and understand the long-term risks they pose to China, they could be expected to respond in ways that might at first seem disproportionate and excessive if they were only compared against the realized and visible complications in these areas. But Dugin is not content just by working from the shadows to undermine China. He is arguing that attacking and conquering Chinese Manchuria is Russia's second highest military priority, right after Ukraine. And this is one of the selected few places where Russia should spend its own resources to get the job done. He fears that if Russia does not attack China, China will use Manchuria to attack Russia in an attempt to capture sparsely populated Lenaland as Lebensraum for its vast population. It is important here to act proactively and not to allow the very possibility of strengthening the Chinese factor in Mongolian politics. It is necessary to intensify positional pressure on northeastern China to take preventive pressure on this area, which would initially prevent any geopolitical incursion of China to northern expansion. In the bigger picture, Dugin envisages annexing Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Manchuria and deploying them against China. Ultimately, Dugin expects that Lenaland will be the main theater of war where the biggest players in the world ultimately settle the control over the planet. And he wants Russia to be as well dug in to the positions there as possible before the Armageddon begins. Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Manchuria together constitute the security belt of Russia. The main task in this region is to make these lands controlled by Heartland, using the potential geopolitical allies of Russia, India and Japan, as well as the local population suffering from Beijing dictatorship. For China itself, this belt is a strategic springboard for a potential breakthrough to the north, to Kazakhstan and Siberia. These are the lands adjacent to Lenaland from the south, around which positional geopolitical confrontation with the leading world forces will inevitably unfold. Russia should tear this bridgehead away from China. And after China has been militarily defeated and territories have been captured from Xinjiang and Manchuria, Dugin is still not satisfied, but he wants to further damage China and benefit from it. He envisions replicating the same plan as for Turkey, that is, depleting its remaining opposing forces in paving way for Russia's later advances. Offer China, as a geopolitical compensation, the development along the north-south axis in the south direction of Indochina, except Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Australia. So, Dugin is looking to achieve a triple victory against China. Firstly, to conquer territories from it in Xinjiang and Manchuria, to utilize China as a puppet to do Russia's heavy lifting in the south, and finally, to destroy China's ability to compete against Russia for continental or global influence. In his book, Dugin seemed mostly complacent in describing actions that are limited only to Eurasia, which would indirectly work against USA's interests. However, there were a few places where he outlined explicit and active measures against the thalassocratic USA on their home turf. He was careful not to even entertain the possibility of a direct military clash, as even a person as delusional as himself knows that there could be only one possible outcome from it. Instead, he focuses on indirect and hybrid actions that could operate well under the threshold of open warfare. It is necessary to counteract the US Atlantic geopolitics at all levels and in all regions of the Earth, trying to weaken, demoralize, deceive, and ultimately defeat the enemy. At the same time, it is especially important to bring geopolitical disorder into intra-American reality, encouraging all kinds of separatism, various ethnic, social, and racial conflicts, actively supporting all dissident movements of extremist, racist, sectarian groups, destabilizing internal political processes in the United States. At the same time, it makes sense to support isolationist tendencies in American politics, the thesis of those often right Republican circles who believe that the United States should limit itself to its internal problems. This state of affairs of Russia is highly beneficial. All levels of geopolitical pressure on the United States should be involved simultaneously. As was the case with the UK, it would be overly generous to award the credit for all recent major political development in USA solely to the influence of Russia. But rather, Russia's interests seem to be having a non-insignificant correlation with certain pre-existing US political aspirations, and the more likely explanation is that these mutually motivated instances are complementing each other's efforts. No one in their right mind could ever intentionally plan to trigger a civil war in their own country, especially if one has already established oneself as the dominant power entity there. Even if this kind of a thought ever popped up to someone's mind, surely it would spark them to take a step backwards and reassess the logic leading up to that idea. Right? And yet, here we are. The civil war in Russia, unfortunately, is possible. The fundamental contradictions between national state interest and the plans of mondialism can hardly be resolved peacefully and amicably. In order to seriously talk about this consensus or truce between these forces, it is necessary either to completely destroy the bearers of national state tendencies, and this is possible only together with the destruction of Russian state and the Russian nation, or to end the representatives of the mondialist lobby. A genuine civilian world cannot be based on a compromise if the two sides of this compromise are all direct opposites. Yes, in such a situation, peace is possible, but at the cost of death of the state and the radical exclusion of the national forces from the dialogue. If the national state system of value becomes dominant, then we can talk about compromises between national capitalists, national socialists, national communists, and national monarchists and national theocrats. But also, in this case, anti-national, mondialist, Russophobic forces will be excluded from the dialogue, ideologically placed outside the law. Our society is fraught with a terrible civil conflict. If we still have the ability to influence the course of events, to choose, then we must choose the lesser of evils. So Dugin is planning, if not to outright trigger, then at least allow a civil war to take place. He feels that the imperialist forces which he represents are physically stronger than the mondialists, so he sees that a conflict can be leveraged as a method to make the opponents of imperialism reveal themselves so that they can be eliminated. While nothing as widely spread as this has happened beyond the Wagner rebellion, something atypical, even on Russian standards, has been taking place during the war. And finally, in a move directly plagiarized from Orwell's 1984, Dugin lists all the possible ways Russian malicious elements might be looking to exploit the instability created by internal and external armed conflicts. For the mondialist lobby, something similar to the civil war in Russia could be beneficial for several more reasons. The outbreak of a military conflict with direct participation of Russians would allow liberals from the center to introduce a political dictatorship under the pretext of saving the fatherland and forcibly getting rid of political opponents. Write off economic collapse to war and force economy to function under the direct control of the center. Distract public attention from the activities of the reformers, which is becoming dangerously obvious today. Knowingly suppress a possible future union of Russians with neighboring nation-state Eurasian and European entities under the sign of continental solidarity against the Atlantic domination of the West and mondialist projects. Of course, no upstanding power element in Russia could ever resort to such despicable measures. So, let's wrap things up by quickly summarizing what Dugin is hoping would happen around the planet if Russia would get to have its way as he envisions it. Yep, totally worth it. Let's roll up the sleeves and get on with this. If you found the ride so far interesting and possess a hefty surplus of popcorns, you definitely do not want to miss out on the next video. In the next one, we'll be examining how Dugin aims to stabilize and operate the empire so that it would allow Russians to stay on top of things for all eternity. This stabilization will include not only mundane governing practices, but goes as far as sketching the requirements for a suitable ideology to achieve this goal. And as a sneak peek, I can promise you this: things will be getting bat excrement crazy. And any and all things we have encountered so far while reviewing this book do not even come close to the lunacy we are about to encounter.